The SharePoint Term Store is incredible. It makes your life so much easier, but most of my clients either haven't heard of it or never think to use it. Let's dive into what this is, how it works, and how it'll make your job a breeze. And if you're new here, my name is Steve Corey, and I'm a consultant for Microsoft 365 products. I work a ton with SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, and Power Platform. After working with SharePoint for over 20 years, I picked up a ton of tips and tricks, which I pass along in these videos. So we'll start with an overview of what the Term Store really is and what it can do for your organization and your SharePoint environment. Then we'll cover a few use cases, some examples of how you would use this Term Store, things you would do with it, and some of the benefits that you would get from it. Then we'll cover the SharePoint Search use, how SharePoint Search fits into this equation to make this Term Store really beneficial and very valuable. We'll cover synonyms, which are a more advanced use case, but something that I see common in environments. Lastly, we'll cover the local use. Now, what I mean by that is using a different type of term store that's specific to a site collection. Less common to see, but still important to know about because of specific situations that I'll cover. So what is this thing anyway? What is this term store? Well, it's something that's been in SharePoint as long as I can remember anyway. It's also a part of Microsoft 365 and SharePoint Online. What it's really designed to do is capture your organizational data, the data that's used to describe various things across your organization, like department listings, official type lists that can be used across your SharePoint environment. And I'll go into some specific use cases for that next. Next, there's the scope. So this thing spans the entire environment inside SharePoint. All the SharePoint sites that you have can use this term store, and they can use the same term store, which is crucial to how all of this works. And lastly, there's tagging. And what I mean by tagging is that you're going to be able to tag data with things inside this term store to associate your data with those terms so that they're all logically grouped, even though they could be spread all throughout your tenant. This is very important to be able to pull data out that relate to that particular tag. And these tags all represent your organizational data, so let's go into that. Now, what I mean by organizational data is metadata that describes the data within your organization. So you may have data that's associated with departments. So departments is a very common thing to see inside the term store. The departments can be defined one time, and across your SharePoint environment, anyone who needs to reference a department can just pull from this one singular list that is maintained by an official source. The same with divisions. All of the divisions across your organization can be defined to ensure that data is tagged according to which division it is. Office locations, document status, products as well, so that you can keep your data associated with these specific terms, and that at any future date, you can pull out all of the data that belongs to a particular product. Clients is another thing that I'll see listed inside the term store because there may be times when you have to pull all of the data you have for a particular client. Rather than knowing where all those things are across your different site collections, you can issue one search and get a list of everything, regardless of whether that's a list item or a document, which is really, really cool. So now you know what type of data should be in the term store. Next, let's talk about the terminology that is used inside the term store so that you know what you're looking at. It all starts with a term. Now, a term represents a value inside the term store. So this would be, in like a department listing example, you would have a term for accounting, a term for human resources, a term for information technology. A term can also have multiple values, but those would be called synonyms, and I'll show you how that works later on in the video. But for now, a term is just the basic object inside the term store. All terms are going to be contained in something called a term set. As you see, this term store is a hierarchy, and I'll show you what that looks like, but the terms are contained in term sets. The term set can contain terms, but it can also contain other term sets. So you could build out a hierarchy just within a term set. And the term set is the really important part in my opinion because this is what you'll map your custom columns to inside your lists and libraries. You don't map them to individual terms, you'll map them to term sets so that when users are adding a list or a document, they'll pick the particular term that should be set as the value for that column. So term sets can contain other term sets, but term sets are ultimately inside a term group. This is kind of the top level container underneath the root of the term store. The term group is going to contain term sets. That's all it's going to contain. It also will serve as a security boundary. So you can define security at a term set for who can add terms, but usually you'll define the security at a term group level to determine who can create term sets and ultimately who's managing the terms inside that particular term group. So starting from the top of the term store, you'll have a term group with a term set with a term, and that's kind of the hierarchy that is built out inside the term store. Now let's jump into the term store and see what everything looks like. So from the SharePoint Admin Center, you can go to Content Services, and underneath that, you can click on Term Store. To get to it without going through the SharePoint Admin Center, you can go to any site where you're an admin, go to the gear icon, Site Information, view all site settings, and then under Site Administration, you'll see Term Store Management. But back to the Admin Center, what you're going to see under the taxonomy node, which is the root node, is you're going to see all the different term groups. You can click on them and you'll see references to renaming the term group, deleting the term group. That's how you know you're on a term group. You'll see a list of group managers, and this is how you can control the access at this level. So if somebody needs the ability to create new term sets under this group, then you can add them to this. In the department list example, this is where I would assign a member of the HR department or whichever members they designate, of course, to be group managers of the group that would have HR related terms that it is their responsibility to maintain. If it's someone else's responsibility or some other departments, obviously you'd put their members here so that they could manage their term sets. But that's assuming they need the ability to create new term sets. If they don't, and they just need the ability to create new terms under term sets, well, if you expand out one of these for blog tags, the group, you'll see that there's a tags term set. In here, you'll see that there's a stakeholders option. You click on edit, you'll be able to assign users to manage this particular term set. And specifically what they'll be able to do is add new terms to it. They can't create new term sets directly underneath the blog tags term group if they're granted access here, but this does give them manage rights to this term set and anything below it. Another thing you'll notice for any object inside this term store is this unique identifier. So this is a GUID, a globally unique identifier that identifies this particular object, this particular term, term set, term group, whatever it is. And behind the scenes, this is really where that connection is being made between data and the terms. You'll see some other options on the term sets. You'll see a usage setting tab. And here you'll see an important option here, whether this term set's available for tagging. So if you were to disable this, like you might do for a mega menu that is pulling from the term store, then with it disabled, then users won't be able to create a custom metadata column that's mapped to this particular term set. And like I said, I'll see this often for term sets that are used for mega menus. And speaking of navigation, you'll see some items here for whether this is used for site navigation, which controls some other things related to navigation like the friendly URLs. Lastly, on the advanced page, you'll see some things related to translations, so you can have different values stored for other languages depending on what your users are using. Now, underneath the tags term set, you'll see my individual terms that are defined. And notice that the icon is different for a term versus a term set versus the blog tags. So visually, that can help you identify what you're looking at as well. And this just being my dev tenant, I have a mixture of a lot of different things in here. So you'll see terms that are used for demos that I may build out and things like that. But moving into what this looks like from a SharePoint list or library kind of view, let's jump over to this site. And I'm inside the policies and procedures library. And I've actually got a few different metadata fields. But if we go into list settings, you'll see what that really looks like when you've got a column mapped over to a term set. As we scroll down, you'll see that I've got a department field and the type is managed metadata. So that tells you this is mapped to something in the term store. We click on department, you'll see the hierarchy right here, and you'll see that it's mapped to that department's term set in my demo terms group. There's also a display value option. So typically you'll just have the term label displayed to the user after they pick the value. But optionally, you can display the entire path, and you see an example of this over here on the left. But what does this look like when you're picking values for this? If we select one of these list items and pull up the details pane and go to the department field, it definitely looks like it's not a text field. And if we click on this add tag, we'll get an option here. Now this field is only set to have a single value, otherwise we would have checkboxes here. But here you could see that it's displaying all of the available departments inside that term set. I could switch it from one department to another and it will save and it's updated. And you see that as well on the list. So now you've seen how the term store looks. You know what those things are that you're looking at, and you know where to go to manage security at different levels. You also know what it looks like from the list perspective, and you see how fast it'll be to build out lists when all you have to do is pick an existing department term set, existing location, existing document status. So much work is being saved now because you're able to utilize that organizational data and not have to worry about if a new office location has been added. Where do you go add that? Where are all the different places where you've built out that list on all of your different sites? Those terms are always up to date because they're always being maintained, or they should. But now let's go into how do you get your users to start using these things? Because after all, if they built out 10 different lists and they all have different department columns using unique values for each one, you're going to be the one who ends up getting the call from that user saying, can you update all of my lists? Or how do I even find all that information? So that brings up an important point. How do you even find this stuff once you do have this information tagged? Where's the benefit other than time saving? Well, let me show you. I mentioned that this integrates very well with SharePoint Search. In my opinion, it was one of the main things that was designed for SharePoint Search. And let me show you what this looks like if someone wants to use this to find data. So I've got this page built out using PnP Modern Search Web Parts, which is a free extension. And if you want to get more information on PnP Modern Search, there's a link at the top of the screen that'll take you to my playlist where I break down all the different components and how to set them all up to do this type of thing. But you'll see here, I'm using office location and department, and I can filter based on a particular department, and it'll show only the search results that come from that department. Now, it's not showing all of my office locations and all of my departments because I don't have all of those locations and departments associated with a piece of data. So since I'm only using the New York location in my data, only New York shows up, but global does as well because I've got this one defined to pull all the locations. But to simplify this a bit, just pure SharePoint search. How do you find this data, even if you don't want to set up a portal like this? Let me create a new page. And I'm just going to delete the text box, and I'm just going to use the PnP search results. So this is just going to display data, nothing fancy about it, no connections to other web parts. So let's configure this. I'm going to use SharePoint search, and in this query template, I can put in my search query. If I just want to put an asterisk, it will display everything. But suppose I want to display everything for a particular department. First, I'm going to go to the SharePoint Admin Center because I want to double check what the managed property is that I need to use, because that department field is mapped to a managed property in the search schema. So I remember using a prefix for all the managed properties for that particular system. So let me type that in and find those properties. Okay, so here's the managed properties I created for that policies and procedures system. So org department is refinable string 120. I could just copy this. And on my page, under the query template, I can put refinable string 120, colon, and then accounting in quotes. And here's all the documents that are tagged with accounting. The display template doesn't look that great because the other template I've used is more customized. But this is all of the content on my entire tenant, actually, that has been tagged with accounting. Because you notice in this query template, I'm not specifying a site. If I was, you would see something that looks like this. So if I was doing something like this, it would limit it to this particular site collection. If I take that out, it is searching the entire tenant since I'm not specifying a specific location. So this is how you'll actually pull that data. I could be on any site collection whatsoever, and I could pull back these same 4 documents. If I had documents on 20 other site collections, then this exact same search query would return a combination of all of those documents, regardless of what site they're on. So pulling content with SharePoint Search is incredibly easy, and when you're looking at data that all is mapped to the same particular terms, it makes it incredibly powerful to find all of your data and not necessarily have to organize it all in one place just so you could find it easier. SharePoint Search doesn't care where it's at, and the powerful keyword query language that you use can find it and present it all in a neat, orderly display like you're saying here. Now, in addition to picking a new term using the add tag, you could also just type into this field. So I could type in accounting and just hit enter, and it chooses the accounting term. But where this really starts to get interesting is with synonyms. So let's go back into the term store and talk about synonyms. So let's go into our demo terms, departments, and accounting. Now, what a synonym will let you do is have a different name for the same term. So instead of accounting being the term that someone has to either type in or pick manually, what I can do is I can click on the English term for this. If you had different variations of accounting for each of your different languages, then you would see those here. But I could click on edit, and for the synonym, I could type in finance. And that'll add finance as a synonym. If I save this, I can go back to this list and I can get rid of accounting and I can type in finance. And look, accounting comes up, and you even see down there it shows finance just as a visual indicator that this is the correct record the person's looking for. So with the synonyms, you can have different variations or even shorthand for some of these things. I've seen this used in a number of different situations where maybe if you have a client listing in the term store, you would have a client ID number. You could have a client ID number as a synonym so that if somebody is copying and pasting information in, they can just paste in the client ID number if they happen to have that handy, and it would select the correct client for them. There's a lot of interesting use cases for synonyms, but I wanted to point out how that actually works. So there's some other concepts I want to get into about user adoption, but first I wanted to point out one last thing inside SharePoint, and that is the local use of term sets. So if you've noticed in site settings, you've got the term store management, and I pointed this out before as well as just an alternative to needing SharePoint admin to get to the term store. You'll see the global term groups here, and this is all the stuff that came from the term store we've been looking at this whole time. But you'll also see site level term groups here. This essentially gives you a local term store for this particular site collection. If you've got a use case where you need to do terms and either you cannot get access to the term store in the SharePoint Admin Center due to red tape or anything like that, then you can create term groups and term sets and terms inside a site collection. Now, it doesn't have the majority of the benefits we've talked about because this would really be local to this site collection. You can definitely share these out with other site collections, so you could start to build out the same thing, but it doesn't have the massive impact that having it centrally located has. But we could click on here and type in a group, maybe local 1. And so we've got our term group here. We still see the same options as before. We could add new term sets. So maybe you wanted blog tags located on this site because this is where your blog's going to live at, and you know you're not going to ever need these tags located anywhere else. You could theoretically add it here. I still would prefer using the SharePoint Admin's term store because that's more than capable of having all the different term groups that you need, but you can set up terms inside a site collection itself. And in the list or library, you would still pick this the same as you would the term sets from the global term group. So it's there. It's not something I necessarily recommend, but you may have situations where this is the only thing you can use. So on to the next concept. So populating that term store with terms is easy. Tagging your data with it is easy. Displaying this in a search interface, whether using PnP Modern Search or some other set of web parts to display search results, that's going to be easy. But here's the other question. You as an admin can do this, but how do you get the users to use this? You don't want to be doing all this stuff for them all the time. You want to empower your users to take more control of their data. And the first step is to show them the benefits of this, to show them what you can do with this, how this can make their job easier. If their job's going to be easier, then more than likely they're going to be on board with this. So then they should be working with the admins, whether that's you or somebody else, to get access to this term store, to talk about what they need from this term store and how they plan on using this term store to categorize their data. Maybe as an admin, maybe you should let them manage a term group. Maybe you should let them manage a term set so that they can start taking charge of that data. and they can start maintaining that. And as an admin, it's important that you know what things are being put into that term store. That way, the next group of users who come and talk to you about getting access to this thing, they may need the data that someone else has already provided. Maybe HR has that department list already maintained and someone's asking to create a department list. Well, you've already got that, so your visibility into what they're doing and what term sets are in that term store is going to be very beneficial, because that second group of users doesn't have to actually do anything. They can just start using it. And lastly, you want to train them on content types. Content types work extremely well with the term store because, just like the term store, content types are all about reusability, creating something one time and being able to just simply add functionality to your site with minimal effort. So getting those users familiar with using content types and how they can benefit, how the term store can fit into that, because you're defining that organizational data in the term store and using it in the content type, is going to be a win-win for you and your users. Some other considerations that you need to think about are who should maintain the different term sets. If the IT department contacts you and wants to create a department listing, then you need to think, are they the correct department to maintain that list, to define that list? Where does that list need to come from? Now, it could be that the department listing is coming from an HR system like PeopleSoft or something else, and maybe that listing just needs to get essentially imported by PowerShell or some other method, some other integration perhaps. And IT wants to maintain that. Well, then that's actually appropriate for IT to handle then, because they're going to be developing a script or some other API call that's going to keep that term set up to date. And HR will actually just maintain it in PeopleSoft or whatever their system is. Otherwise, if IT is trying to maintain this manually, then you need to take a step back and think, are they the correct department to do this? Or should you reach out to HR or to executive leaders to talk about who should maintain that official list? Once you've determined that, then user training is needed here so that people understand what this term store is, how to get into it, and then how to maintain that list so that they're doing things the correct way and the way that the SharePoint admins would prefer. Lastly, you want to plan everything out. You want to look ahead and come up with all the different term sets that you think would be useful and are needed in the current environment as well as the future environment, and plan out that hierarchy. Do you want some data grouped into one particular term group? Do you want to split up into different term groups, knowing that the security is going to be a little different on those? How you do that is really up to you. But planning everything out is going to help you ensure you don't have to try and rearrange things later on or have weird processes in place because things weren't planned correctly. I hope you found this content informative and useful. Let me know down in the comments below what you think, and subscribe to the channel for more content like this.